Hi, my name is Lucia Renikoff, and I'll be talking about the poem Harlem Nightclub by Langston Hughes. So, in this poem, Hughes talks about a jazz band throughout, and it's sort of written with a lyrical writing, so we get the sense that it was probably written for a song. His use of like rhythm as you read it and punctuation sort of gives us the sense that it was performed by probably a jazz band. It's as you read it, you realize it's sort of happy and upbeat, and as if it was something performed by a band. And you can see by his use of punctuation, like exclamation points and various capital letters, and he sort of accentuates some of the more upbeat words, and this gives us the idea that it's lyrical. So behind all this, this happy sense that jazz music usually gives us, as we've learned about Langston Hughes, that he was writing in a time of where jazz music was becoming really popular. He, if you look closer at the actual text and the deeper meaning of the poem, we see that it's not at all very upbeat. He's talking about some like serious topics. So we know this through Langston Hughes' background. So he was brought up in a time of a lot of racism and inequality, and that's a lot of what has to do with the poem. So we see the literal meaning of the poem being a jazz band playing for just people, and it's very upbeat, but the figurative meaning is talking about a lot of separation of races, and we see this where he sort of switches off every line and stanza from talking about, for example, white girls, and then the next line he says, call gay black boys, and then he says, black boys' lips grin jungle joy. So this is talking about separation between the white girls and the black boys, and he goes on and does this throughout the poem later as well. And so he talks about at the end of stanza 4, he says, where all the paths go. He says, about tomorrow, where all the paths go. So I think this is sort of hinting at he's wondering about the future of racism and how it's sort of unknown, because it's so extreme at this point in time that he doesn't know when things are going to improve, or when we're going to overcome inequality. And he says at the beginning, or at the end, he says, tomorrow is darkness, joy today. So I think he's talking about sort of celebrating today because tomorrow is dark, and sort of living in the moment because, in this time period, all these other dark things are happening. So you need to enjoy like the good moments while they last, because in the end of the day, there's these huge overlying issues for African Americans like Langston Hughes. And I think that this poem is sort of, he's like implying that a lot of people try to cover up the darkness that's going on in this era of time. So I think that's a really big theme, is just the idea that the poem seems very upbeat and positive, but when you look closer at what he's actually saying and like the figurative meaning, you see that it's not at all happy. Also, Langston Hughes uses repetition in the first and last paragraph. So he says, jazz band, play, play, play. Tomorrow, who knows, dance today. in the first stanza, and then the last one he says, jazz boys, play, play, play. Tomorrow is darkness, joy today. And I think it's important because I think he's showing how there's not a lot of progress that's being made because of the repetition. He goes on in the middle and sort of varies what he's talking about, but he comes back to what he says at the beginning in the first stanza and says the same thing except for the last line. And I think this could represent how he feels that there has been not a lot of progress in overcoming inequality in this time period. And I think the most important part of the poem is the last two lines of the first and last stanza, where in the first one he says, "Tomorrow, who knows? Dance today," and then in line 20 he says, "Tomorrow is darkness." And I think that this shows how it's clear that these problems he thinks won't be resolved. So you should like live for today. And I think at first he's sort of, at the beginning of the poem, he's more upbeat about it. So he's saying, tomorrow, who knows? Maybe something could improve tomorrow. But in the last one, he's sort of come to the conclusion that tomorrow is darkness, just like every other day that he's experiencing as an African American in this time period. The last thing is Hughes talks about, or Hughes' use of symbolism, and we can infer that the jazz band represents hope of the African American people. Jazz music is a lot of trumpets and saxophones, which are really upbeat and sort of happy instruments, and they're playing sort of loud and proud, but like the underlying messages in each stanza are sort of in the last like few sentences. So he talks about the jazz bands throughout, and I think this sort of symbolizes hope for the African American people, because it's like we see that like the jazz band is like, they're very like proud to be African American, but in this time period it's hard. And I think sort of that deep down, like, these people are very unhappy about what's going on, and so their hope can only last so long, and that's sort of what the jazz band in this is talking about. I think also he questions a couple times in the poem. For example, he says, "Where all the paths go." So I think this sort of shows uncertainty about tomorrow, and the hope of African American people in like racism and overcoming inequality.